If you have ever been inside a Christian church, you have probably heard these words. We believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. Most people who hear those words hear them as settled truth, ancient, obvious, the kind of language that has always been there, like the walls of the building around them. What almost no one knows is that every single word of that passage was chosen carefully, deliberately, and at enormous cost, to answer a question that one man refused to stop asking, a question that split a religion, pulled an emperor away from running an empire, and came closer to changing the entire direction of Christian history than almost anyone today realizes. The man who asked it died in a street in Constantinople in the year 336. Alone, at night, one day, before everything was supposed to be resolved. His name was Arius. And before this is over, you are going to understand why the words you just heard could not exist without him. Here is what makes his story genuinely strange. Arius lost. He was condemned by the largest gathering of Christian bishops in history. His name became, for 17 centuries, the word the Church used when it wanted to say wrong, heretic, the man who got it wrong about Jesus. But in the 50 years after that condemnation, nearly the entire Christian world went his direction anyway. The emperors who followed Constantine were sympathetic to what Arius had taught. The Gothic peoples who would eventually sack Rome were Christians, but they were Arian Christians. For half a century after Nicaea, the council that was supposed to have settled everything, the question was still so open that one of the greatest theologians of the era looked out at the church and wrote that the whole world groaned and was astonished to find itself Arian. The whole world, astonished, 30 years after the council that condemned him. That is the story we are about to tell. A story about a question that was too real to kill, a council that was too political to fully succeed, and a man who died the night before his restoration in a street no one can find anymore, in a city that no longer exists by the name he knew it. To understand the night he died, you have to understand what he lived for, and to understand that, you have to go back to the city that made him, back to a place where questions were not just academic exercises, where the wrong question, asked loudly enough, could change the world. You have to go to Alexandria. Walk into Alexandria in the year 318, and you will immediately understand why this particular city produced this particular crisis. Every major port city in the ancient world was a place where things mixed. Goods, languages, people, ideas. That was the nature of trade. But Alexandria mixed things at a depth that other cities did not reach, because Alexandria had been built, from its very foundation, with the specific intention of being a place where the Greek world and everything east of it could meet and speak the same language. Alexander the Great designed it that way in 331 before Christ. The library that became its symbol was not an accident of history. It was a statement of purpose. We are going to gather everything humanity knows and put it in one place. And then we are going to see what happens when it all sits next to itself. What happened over 5 centuries was a city that could not stop thinking. Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek there. producing the Septuagint, the version of the Old Testament that most early Christians read. Greek philosophers built schools there that pushed Platonic thought into directions Plato himself would not have recognized. Egyptian religious traditions that stretched back thousands of years ran underneath everything else like groundwater, shaping the imagination of the city in ways people felt without always being able to name, and layered over all of it, by the early 4th century, was a Christian community that had been growing for nearly 3 centuries and that had absorbed, as Alexandria absorbed everything, the full intellectual inheritance of the world around it. This is the city Arius called home. He was not born there. He came from Libya, most likely, and arrived in Alexandria as a young man to study under a theologian named Lucian of Antioch. Lucian ran a school with a specific and serious approach to Scripture. He read the text closely. He read it in the original languages. He believed that the words meant what they said, and that the job of a serious reader was to follow those words wherever they led, even if they led somewhere that made people uncomfortable. He passed this habit to everyone who sat in his classroom, and among all the students who studied under Lucian, Arius was the one who took that habit most completely to heart. By the time he was established in Alexandria as the presbyter of the district of Baucalis, Arius was not a young man. He was somewhere in his 60s, dull, thin from decades of disciplined fasting. He had the kind of presence that comes from a person who has spent a long time being genuinely serious about something. People in his district knew him. The widows who had no one else to advocate for them knew him. The sailors who worked the harbor and had no interest in abstract theology knew him. He showed up for people. He remembered their names. He was the kind of priest that a community builds its trust around over years. And he had been building that trust in Baucalis for a long time. He was also, and this is the detail that almost always gets left out, a gifted writer of popular songs. This is not a minor footnote about his personality. It is central to understanding how the controversy that bears his name spread as fast and as wide as it did. Arius composed a work called the Thalia, which translates roughly as the banquet or the festival. It was a collection of theological poems set to music, but not music for scholars, music for everyone. He wrote in the meters and rhythms of the popular songs that dock workers hummed while they unloaded cargo, and merchants sang while they counted inventory. He took the most serious questions about the nature of God and Christ and put them in a form that a person with no theological training could carry home in their head after a single hearing. His opponents hated this with a passion that reveals how effective it was. Athanasius, who would spend his entire career arguing against everything Arius taught, complained that Arius was spreading dangerous theology through catchy tunes that people were singing in the streets of Alexandria. He meant it as a devastating criticism. He was also, without intending to, describing something that most theologians of his era completely failed to understand about how ideas actually move through a population. Ideas that live only in lecture halls and written treatises change the minds of scholars. Ideas that get into songs change the world. Arius understood this. His opponents understood it only well enough to be furious about it. But before we can understand what Arius was singing about, we need to sit with the problem he was singing about. Because the problem was not one he invented. It had been sitting at the center of Christian thought since the very beginning. And it had been sitting there because it was genuinely hard. And everyone who had looked at it directly had eventually decided that looking slightly to the side was more comfortable. Here is the problem. Christianity inherited from Judaism the most fundamental claim in all of Jewish theology. There is one God. The Shema, the central prayer of Jewish worship, says it without qualification. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. The Lord is one. This was not negotiable. It was not a poetic preference or a theological opinion that could be softened around the edges. It was the foundation. One God. Full stop. And then Christianity said something else. It said that Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God, that he had existed before his birth in Bethlehem, that through him all things were made, that he was the Word of God made flesh, that knowing him was knowing God, that worshipping him was the right response of a human being to the divine. These two things, one God and the full divinity of Jesus, had lived together in Christian thought for nearly 3 centuries without anyone being forced to explain, in precise and unambiguous language, exactly how they fit together. Different communities in different cities used different words. Some spoke of Father and Son in ways that made them sound almost interchangeable. Others preserved a clear distinction between them. The great Alexandrian teacher, Origen, writing in the century before Arius, had explored the relationship between Father and Son with extraordinary philosophical depth and had ultimately produced a picture that was rich and suggestive, at key points deliberately unclear, because Origen understood that the question was hard enough that premature clarity was more dangerous than honest ambiguity. That ambiguity had been, for 3 centuries, a gift. It allowed different communities to hold the faith with different emphases without breaking apart. It allowed teachers to explore the question from different angles without anyone being forced to draw a line in the sand. It allowed the Church to be a broad and diverse movement rather than a narrow institution policing its own boundaries. But ambiguity does not last forever, especially not in Alexandria, where intellectual pressure was higher than anywhere else in the Christian world, where Jewish monotheism and Greek philosophy and Christian devotion were packed so close together that the friction between them generated heat that had to go somewhere. What Arius did, starting around the year 318, was take that ambiguity and refuse it. He had been thinking about the question for years. He had read the texts, he had followed the arguments, and he had arrived at a position that he believed was honest, scripturally grounded, and logically coherent. He began teaching it in his church at Baucalis. He began writing it into his songs. He began saying, clearly, and without the comfortable fog of ambiguity that had allowed the question to stay safely open, what he believed the texts actually taught. What happened next moved faster than anyone anticipated. Alexandria was a city where theological ideas spread through the population, the way fires spread through dry wood. Arius was not whispering his conclusions to a small circle of students. He was preaching them to a congregation that trusted him and singing them into the streets. Within a short time, the whole city knew that a significant priest was teaching something specific about the relationship between Father and Son, and that what he was teaching was not what the Bishop of Alexandria had been teaching. The Bishop of Alexandria was a man named Alexander. He was learned, serious, and genuinely committed to the faith he had spent his life serving. He was not a politician looking for an excuse to crush a rival. He was a theologian who heard what Arius was teaching and understood, immediately and with alarm, what was at stake. Because here is what Alexander understood that the popular reception of Arius sometimes missed. The question was not simply about theological terminology or the correct way to arrange Greek philosophical concepts. The question had a razor edge that cut to the heart of what Christianity claimed to offer. If the Son is not fully divine in the same absolute sense as the Father, then, when Christians worship the Son, they are directing worship towards something that is less than God, a magnificent, incomparable, utterly unique being, but not God in the ultimate sense. And a tradition built on Jewish monotheism cannot worship something less than God without becoming something other than what it claims to be. And further than that, if the Son is not fully divine, then the salvation that Christianity proclaimed, the claim that God had entered human experience in order to heal it from the inside, rested on a being who was not fully God reaching into human life. And Alexander believed, with the kind of conviction that makes a person genuinely formidable in an argument, that a being who is less than fully God cannot bridge the gap between the Creator and the creation, cannot fully save what it has not fully shared. The whole structure of Christian salvation, in Alexander's understanding, required a Son who was genuinely and completely divine. Or it required a completely different account of what salvation meant. These were not small stakes. This was not a dispute over words. This was a dispute over whether the thing at the center of the faith was what the faith had always claimed it was. Alexander summoned Arius. He asked him to reconsider. He explained his concerns. Arius listened and then continued teaching what he had been teaching. Because Arius believed that theological honesty was not a preference to be adjusted based on what the bishop found comfortable. It was an obligation. Alexander called a council of the bishops of Egypt and Libya. They heard both positions. They voted. Arius and his supporters were condemned and ordered to leave Alexandria. Arius left, but he did not go quietly. And he did not go far, and he did not stop. He went to Caesarea in Palestine, and then to Nicaea in what is now northwestern Turkey. And in both places he found bishops who had studied under the same teacher he had studied under, who thought the question he was raising deserved a better hearing than Alexandria had given it, and who were willing to say so. He wrote letters. He sent his songs back to Alexandria. He built, from exile, a network of support that stretched across the eastern half of the empire. The controversy that Alexander had hoped to resolve by expelling Arius from the city did not resolve. It expanded, and it was about to become impossible for the most powerful man in the world to ignore. But first, you need to understand what Arius was actually saying, because the version of his teaching that his enemies passed down is a caricature, and the caricature makes the whole story smaller and less interesting than it actually was. What he believed was more precise, more carefully reasoned, and more genuinely challenging than the caricature suggests. And you cannot understand why it shook an empire until you understand why it was so hard to simply dismiss. Start with something simple. You are a Christian living in Alexandria in the year 318. You have grown up in the faith. You know the prayers. You know the stories. You believe that Jesus was the Son of God, that he died and rose again, and that through him something fundamental about the relationship between God and humanity had changed forever. You have never needed to articulate exactly what that meant in philosophical terms because no one had ever asked you to. You believed it the way you believed the sun would rise. It was simply there. And then someone asks you a question you have never been asked quite this directly before. When the Gospels say that Jesus is the Son of God, what does son mean? Exactly. You think about it. Son implies a relationship. A father produces a son. The son comes from the father. That much seems clear enough. The person asking nods and goes one step further. If the son comes from the father, was there a moment, or at least a state, before the son came from the father, when the son did not yet exist? And now you feel something shift, because the logic is clean and simple, and you cannot immediately find the flaw in it. If someone is produced by someone else, then the producing had to happen at some point. And before it happened, the one being produced was not yet there. This is the question Arius was asking, and this is why it had the power it had. It was not a wild claim or an attack from outside the tradition. It grew directly out of reading the texts that every Christian accepted as authoritative and following their words with a rigorous honesty that most people preferred to avoid. Arius put his conclusion into language that became the most quoted sentence of the entire controversy. In the original Greek, it was 5 words. In English, it comes out as something like this: there was, when he was not, there was a state, before the Son existed, when the Son had not yet been brought into being by the Father. The Son had a beginning, and anything that has a beginning is, in some fundamental sense, not eternal in the same absolute way as the one who has always been. Now, before you decide how you feel about that, you need to sit with what Arius was and was not saying, because the version of his teaching that his enemies spread through the church, and that most people inherit when they first encounter his name, is missing something essential. Arius was not saying that Jesus was an ordinary man. He was not saying that the disciples had misunderstood a purely human teacher and elevated him into something he was not. He was not saying anything that a modern skeptic about religion might say. He believed that the Son existed before all creation. He believed that the Son was the being through whom God made everything else that exists. He believed that the Son was so far above any other created thing that the distance between the Son and the rest of creation was almost impossible to measure. He believed the Son was genuinely divine in a meaningful sense, genuinely worthy of reverence, genuinely unlike anything else in existence. What he was saying was that this same Son, for all his incomparable greatness, was not the Father, was not co-eternal with the Father in the absolute sense that the Father is eternal, was not, in the Greek philosophical language that educated Christians of his era used, of the same substance as the Father. The Father alone, in Arius's understanding, is truly and completely God in the ultimate sense, unbegotten, without source, without origin, without beginning. The Father simply is, in a way that requires no further explanation, because the Father is the ground of all being itself, the one of whom nothing prior can be said. The Son is real. The Son is divine in a genuine sense. The Son is the highest and greatest of all that exists. But the Son received his existence from the Father. The Father willed the Son into being, and anything that receives its existence from something else is, in some meaningful sense, dependent on that something else, secondary to it, not the ultimate source. to Arius. This was not a diminishment of Christ. It was an act of theological precision that he believed the faith desperately needed. He thought he was protecting the absolute uniqueness of the one God of Jewish and Christian monotheism. If you said that the Son was co-eternal and co-equal with the Father in every ultimate respect, you were not clarifying the relationship between them. You were collapsing it in a way that raised a question Arius considered even more dangerous: if both Father and Son are equally and fully God in the ultimate sense. Do Christians worship one God or two? That was the fear driving his position. A real fear, a theologically serious fear. And the people who dismiss it as obviously confused have usually not sat with it long enough to feel its weight. The bishops who condemned him at Alexandria had their own fear, and it was equally real and equally serious. We heard it from Alexander in the last chapter. But there was another dimension to it that went beyond Alexander, a dimension that Athanasius would spend his whole career articulating with a clarity that no one before him had quite achieved. Think about what Christians believed the Incarnation actually was. The claim was not simply that God sent a special messenger into the world to deliver a message about how to live. The claim was that God entered human experience directly, that the one who became human in Jesus was genuinely and fully God, not a representative of God or a being very close to God, but God himself, taking on human flesh, sharing in what it means to be a creature, living and suffering and dying from the inside of the human condition. And the point of this, the reason it mattered so much, was that only by genuinely sharing in human nature from the inside could the divine life transform human nature from the inside. The logic ran like this: what is not assumed is not healed. If God only appeared to become human, or sent a being who was close to God but not fully God, then God had not genuinely entered the human condition. And if God had not genuinely entered it, then the human condition had not been genuinely transformed by the divine life. Salvation became a declaration from outside rather than a transformation from within. This is why the question Arius raised was not, for his opponents, a technical matter of getting the metaphysics right. It was a question about whether the thing they had built their entire lives on was actually doing what they believed it was doing. If the Son is less than fully God, then, in the Incarnation, something less than fully God became human, and something less than fully God cannot bring human beings into the life of God, because it does not have that life to give in the fullness that would be required. You have two fears now, sitting on opposite sides of the same question. Arius feared that saying the Son was co-eternal and co-equal with the Father meant worshipping two gods, which destroyed the monotheism that Christianity had inherited from Judaism, and that was not negotiable. Alexander and Athanasius feared that saying the Son was less than fully God meant the salvation Christianity proclaimed was built on something that could not bear the weight being placed on it. Both fears were legitimate. Both pointed at something real, and neither side could simply look at the other side's fear and say, "Yes, I see your point. Let us find a middle ground." Because the middle ground did not exist in a way that satisfied the logic of either position. This is why the controversy spread so fast and ran so deep. It was not a dispute between a reckless priest and a defensive institution. It was a collision between two genuine theological commitments, each of which had something essential to protect, and which could not both be fully honored at the same time with the conceptual tools available in the 4th century. Arius taught his position in his church at Baucalis. He sang it into the streets through the Thalia. His songs moved through Alexandria, the way the most effective pieces of popular culture always move, carried by people who found them memorable before they had fully thought through what they were agreeing to. Sailors hummed the melodies on the docks. Merchants repeated the phrases in the markets. The question of whether the Son was co-eternal with the Father or had a beginning before which he did not exist was, for a period in Alexandria, not just a question for councils and classrooms. It was a question that people argued about on their way home from work. Alexander responded by calling a council and expelling Arius. Arius responded by leaving Alexandria and building a network of support across the Eastern Church. The expelled priest wrote letters to sympathetic bishops. He sent his songs back to Alexandria with people who would distribute them. He made arguments that found receptive audiences in cities across the Eastern Mediterranean. And the controversy, instead of contracting after Alexander's condemnation, expanded. It expanded because the question Arius was asking did not go away when the man asking it was sent into exile. The question was in the texts. Anyone who read the texts carefully enough and honestly enough could feel it. The Christian community had been managing it through comfortable ambiguity for 3 centuries. Arius had removed the comfort, and once that comfort was removed, everyone who had been relying on it without knowing they were relying on it had to figure out where they actually stood. That process of figuring out where you actually stood was about to acquire, whether anyone wanted it to or not, the attention of an emperor. But before we get to Constantine, we need to meet the man who would become the other central figure of this story. The man who heard the question Arius was asking and felt, with a clarity that would never leave him, that the answer Arius was giving was not just wrong but catastrophic. The man who would spend 45 years as a bishop, 17 of them in exile, fighting to hold a line that the whole world kept trying to push him off of. His name was Athanasius, and he was, in most of the ways that mattered to the world watching him, losing for almost all of his adult life. There is a specific kind of person who becomes most themselves under pressure, not the person who performs well under pressure, which is a different thing. The person who performs well under pressure is managing something. They have learned techniques. They have built habits that carry them through hard moments until the hard moment passes. That person is admirable, and most of us spend our lives trying to become that person on our better days. The kind of person I am describing is different. For this person, pressure does not reveal a technique. It reveals a nature. Who they are when everything is against them is simply who they are, expressed more completely than ordinary circumstances ever allow. Take away the pressure, and you still have the person. Add the pressure, and you have the person in full. Athanasius of Alexandria was that kind of person. He was born sometime around the year 296 in Alexandria, which means he grew up inside the same city that had formed Arius, breathing the same air of intellectual intensity, absorbing the same habits of serious and relentless theological inquiry. He came to the attention of Bishop Alexander as a young man, sharp enough and committed enough to be taken into the bishop's household as a close assistant and secretary. By the time the controversy with Arius broke fully into the open around 318, Athanasius was somewhere in his early 20s, young enough that most people in the room were not thinking about him, old enough to understand exactly what was at stake in a way that would shape every decision he made for the next 50 years. What Athanasius grasped, with a clarity that was unusual even in a city full of clear thinkers, was something that we touched on at the end of the last chapter, but that deserves its full weight here. The argument Arius was making was not primarily a philosophical dispute about Greek terminology. It was a question about salvation, about what Christianity actually claimed to offer human beings, and whether that claim held together if Arius was right. The argument Athanasius would spend his life making ran like this: God became human so that humans might become God. He did not mean that human beings literally become identical to God. He meant that human beings are capable of genuine participation in divine life, that the trajectory of human existence, when it is fully what God intends it to be, is not simply moral improvement or better behavior or a more enlightened understanding of the world. It is genuine transformation, a real sharing in the life that God is. What the Greek theological tradition called theosis, deification, the actual drawing of human nature into the divine nature through union with Christ. This claim, which is at the heart of the most ancient strands of Christian theology in both East and West, stands or falls entirely on the question of who Christ is. If Christ is genuinely and fully divine, then in union with Christ, human beings are genuinely and fully brought into contact with the divine life. The transformation is real because the source of it is real. But if Christ is a created being, however magnificent, however far above everything else in existence, then union with Christ is union with something that is not fully God. And union with something that is not fully God cannot bring human beings fully into the life of God, because the being they are united with does not have that life to give in the way that would be required. Athanasius saw this with the kind of single-minded clarity that some people find inspiring and others find exhausting. He was not a man who held his convictions lightly, or who found nuance in places where he believed the logic was clear. He believed the logic was clear. He believed Arius was wrong in a way that mattered more than almost any other theological error could matter, because the error went to the foundation on which everything else rested. And he believed that people who understood what was actually at stake could not, in good conscience, to be satisfied with a formula that left the question open. He became Bishop of Alexandria in the year 328, 3 years after the Council of Nicaea that we will come to in the next 2 chapters. He was young for the position, probably in his early 30s, and his election was contested from the start. Bishops who had been sympathetic to Arius or to the various semi-Arian positions that occupied the broad middle ground of 4th century theology saw Athanasius as an obstacle to the kind of reconciliation they were trying to build. They were not wrong. Athanasius had no interest in reconciliation on terms that required softening the formula Nicaea had produced. He was not a man who softened formulas. What followed was one of the most remarkable careers in the history of any institution anywhere. He was exiled 5 times, 5 separate exiles, 4 different emperors who decided, at different moments and for different reasons, that the Bishop of Alexandria was causing more trouble than he was worth and needed to be removed. The first exile came in 335, when his enemies at the Council of Tyre brought charges against him, some of which had a basis in reality, even if the motivation behind them was political. Constantine, who by that point was trying to broker a peace that would quiet the Arian controversy, saw Athanasius as the main obstacle to that peace and had him sent to Trier, a city in the far northwest of the empire, about as far from Alexandria as you could go while remaining inside Roman territory. Constantine died in 337. His son Constantius II eventually took control of the eastern half of the empire. Constantius was genuinely sympathetic to the anti-Nicene theological positions in a way his father had never quite been. And under his reign, the pressure on Athanasius intensified dramatically. The second exile lasted a decade, 10 years, during which Athanasius lived in Rome, in the Egyptian desert, in small communities of monks who sheltered him when no institutional structure would. 10 years during which councils were called that condemned him, in which emperors issued orders for his removal, in which the theological position he represented was officially declared wrong by multiple gatherings of bishops. Jerome, reflecting on this period years later, wrote a sentence that has stuck in Christian memory ever since. "The whole world groaned," he said, "and was astonished to find itself Arian." Hold that sentence for a moment, because it is not hyperbole. In the middle decades of the 4th century, the official position of the imperial church, enforced by the ruling emperor, backed by the majority of Eastern bishops, was not Nicene. The council that had condemned Arius was being quietly dismantled by the same imperial machinery that had produced it. Formulas that softened or replaced homoousios were being signed. Bishops who refused to sign them were being removed. Athanasius refused to sign. Athanasius was removed. Again, and then again, and then again after that. His third exile, his fourth, his fifth. The phrase that became permanently attached to his name did not come from a moment of triumph. It came from a moment of almost complete isolation. When told that the whole world had turned against him, Athanasius replied with words that in Latin became the sentence every student of church history eventually encounters: Athanasius contra Mundum. Athanasius against the world? He was not being dramatic. He was describing the situation accurately. But here is the thing about Athanasius that gets lost when the story gets told as a simple narrative of a hero who held the line against heresy until the good guys won. He was losing for most of his adult life. He did not know, while he was living through exile number 3 or exile number 4, that the theological position he was defending would eventually become the standard of orthodoxy in the Catholic Church. The Orthodox Church, and most of the Protestant traditions that would emerge over 1,000 years later. He knew that he had been condemned by councils. He knew that emperors had ordered him removed. He knew that the majority of Eastern bishops, at various points in his career, had signed documents saying his position was wrong. He knew that the man whose legacy he was defending, the Nicene formula, was being abandoned by the very institution that had issued it. And he kept going anyway. There is a temptation, when telling this story, to make Athanasius into a simple figure of heroic virtue standing against institutional corruption. That temptation should be resisted. He was a complicated man. Some of the charges brought against him at the Council of Tyre were not invented. His conduct as bishop was, atimes, harsh in ways that had nothing to do with theological conviction and everything to do with the exercise of institutional power. He used the tools available to him, and some of those tools were not clean. He was also on the central question, entirely unwilling to move. And that unwillingness, whatever you think of the methods that sometimes accompanied it, was the thing that mattered in the long run, because the story of the Arian controversy is, in significant part, a story about what happens when almost everyone bends and one person does not, when councils reverse their decisions and emperors change their minds, and bishops sign one formula and then another and then another. And through all of it, one figure in Alexandria keeps writing letters and treatises and arguments, insisting that the question is not actually settled, that the word the council chose was the right word, that the line being erased was the line that had to hold. Athanasius outlasted 4 emperors. He outlasted the councils that condemned him. He returned from his 5th exile and spent the last 7 years of his life as Bishop of Alexandria without being exiled again. He died in the year 373. He was 75 years old, or close to it. He had been bishop for 45 years and had spent 17 of them outside his own city. A few years after his death, the Emperor Theodosius I made Nicene Christianity the official faith of the Roman Empire and called the Council of Constantinople in 381 to reaffirm and expand the Nicene formula. The position that Athanasius had defended through 5 exiles and 4 hostile emperors became, in the years just after he died, the law of the empire. He did not live to see it, but he had made it possible. Now hold both figures in your mind at once. Arius, the presbyter of Baucalis, who asked the question the tradition had been avoiding for 3 centuries and refused to stop asking it even after being expelled and condemned. Athanasius, the bishop who heard that question and spent his entire adult life insisting that the answer Nicaea gave was the only answer the faith could live with, even when every emperor and most of the bishops of the Eastern Church were telling him he was wrong. 2 men, 1 question, both of them, for the better part of their lives, losing in ways the world could measure. The difference between them was not that one was right and one was wrong in any simple sense. The difference was what each of them believed was at stake. Arius believed that theological honesty required saying what the logic of Scripture seemed plainly to say, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it required admitting that the Son was something other than the Father in the most ultimate sense. Athanasius believed that the salvation of every human being who would ever live depended on the answer to the question Arius had raised, and that the wrong answer was not just a theological mistake, but a catastrophe from which the faith could not recover. When you believe the stakes are that high, you do not look for the comfortable middle ground. You stand where you stand, and you wait for the world to catch up with you. Even if waiting costs you 17 years and 5 exiles and the company of monks in the Egyptian desert when no one else will have you. And then, when you are old and have outlasted all your enemies, when the emperor has finally moved in your direction and the formula you spent your life defending is being written into the official creeds of councils, you write a letter to your community telling them that the struggle has not been wasted. But before any of that, before the 5th exile and the return and the letter that closes with the exhausted satisfaction of a man who has outlasted everyone who tried to remove him, before any of it, there was the man who made all of it necessary, the man who did not care about homoousios or homoousios, who could not follow the Greek theological arguments in the language they were being made, who had an empire to hold together and a church that was tearing itself apart over a question he could barely formulate. let alone answer. He cared about one thing above everything else. He needed this to stop. In the year 312, a man standing outside Rome made a decision that changed the history of the Western world. His name was Constantine. He was about to fight the most important battle of his life against his rival Maxentius for control of the Western Roman Empire. The night before the battle, according to the account he would tell for the rest of his life, he saw something, a vision, a sign in the sky. The Christian sources say it was a cross of light with words beside it in this sign, Contra. Constantine ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with a symbol associated with Christ. He crossed the river. He won. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber. Constantine entered Rome as the master of the West and entered it with a conviction that the God of the Christians had given him his victory. What followed moved quickly. The Edict of Milan in 313 made Christianity legal across the empire. Property confiscated from Christian communities was returned. Christians who had been imprisoned were freed. The faith that had survived 3 centuries as a minority movement, often underground, sometimes hunted, was suddenly under the protection of the most powerful man in the Roman world. You need to feel the size of that shift to understand everything that comes after it. For the generation that lived through it, the change was almost too large to process. One generation had watched family members die in the arenas for refusing to sacrifice to Roman gods. The next generation was watching the emperor pour money into building Christian basilicas and invite bishops to his table. The God who had seemed, from the outside, to be losing the argument with Rome for 3 centuries had, in the space of a decade, apparently won it. Constantine was not a simple man, and his relationship to Christianity was not simple. He kept the title Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the traditional Roman religion. He kept the image of the sun god on his coins for years after his conversion. He was not baptized until he was dying, which was not unusual for Christians of his era, but which also tells you something honest about how he held his faith. He was a man who had made a bet on the Christian God and believed, with increasing sincerity as the years passed, that the bet had paid off repeatedly. But he was also a man who had spent his entire adult life thinking about power, and he understood religion the way a man who thinks about power understands everything through the lens of what it can do. What religion could do, in Constantine's understanding, was bind a population together, give millions of people across dozens of languages and cultures a shared story and shared rituals and a shared sense that they were part of something larger than themselves that was also, crucially, aligned with the emperor's authority. A unified religion was a tool of imperial unity. It was perhaps the most powerful such tool available to him. A divided religion was the exact opposite of that. And by the early 320s, the reports reaching Constantine from the eastern provinces described something that looked, from the perspective of a man trying to hold together a vast empire, somewhere between troubling and farcical. Bishops were writing furious letters to each other across the Mediterranean. Communities that had worshipped side by side for decades were fracturing over a theological formula. In Alexandria, the situation had become public enough that sailors and merchants and dock workers were picking sides in a debate about the eternal nature of the Son of God. And the bishop and one of his most popular priests were in open conflict in ways that could not be contained within the usual ecclesiastical channels. Constantine wrote a letter. He sent it east with his personal religious advisor, a Spanish bishop named Hosius of Cordoba, who was to deliver it to both Alexander and Arius and explain to them, on behalf of the emperor, that this needed to stop now. The letter has survived. Reading it today, you can hear the specific frustration of a man who cannot understand why intelligent people are destroying something he needs to be intact. Constantine does not take a theological side. He does not say Alexander is right or Arius is right. What he says, with the impatience of someone who has real problems to manage and cannot understand why the people he has been protecting are creating new ones, is that the whole argument is trivial. These are questions, he writes, that should have stayed inside the minds of philosophers rather than been thrown before the general public. The men fighting over them are failing to maintain the unity that God requires and that the empire needs. He was completely wrong that the argument was trivial, and he was completely right that the fighting was dangerous. Hosius traveled east and discovered what Constantine had not yet fully grasped. A letter was not going to fix this. The positions were too defined, the communities too divided, the theological stakes too clearly understood by the people on both sides for a personal appeal from the emperor's representative to close the gap. What was needed was not a letter, it was a decision, an authoritative determination, made at a level that the whole church would have to respect, of which position was correct and which was wrong. Constantine arrived at the solution that powerful people throughout history arrive at when they need a question answered and cannot answer it themselves. He called a meeting, not a small meeting, the largest gathering of Christian bishops that had ever taken place. Representatives from every province of the empire, and some from beyond it, were invited. Their travel and lodging would be paid for by the imperial treasury. They would assemble at the city of Nicaea, conveniently located near Constantine's current residence at Nicaea, in the spring of 325, and they would settle the question. What Constantine wanted from the council was simple, in the way that the desires of powerful people are often simple. He wanted a result. He wanted the bishops to come in, argue it out, reach a conclusion that the whole church could hold, and go home. He was not particularly interested in which conclusion they reached, as long as they reached one and stuck to it. Unity was the goal. The theological content of the unity was, to him, secondary. This is the thing that most people misunderstand about Nicaea, and it is important enough to say clearly. Constantine did not go to that council with a theological position he wanted to impose on the bishops. He did not invent the Nicene formula or dictate its contents. He went to that council because he needed the arguing to stop, and he had enough power to compel the church to sit in a room together until it produced something he could point to as a resolution. The theology came from the bishops. The consequences of the theology came from the emperor. That combination, theology, given the force of imperial authority, was genuinely new in Christian history, and it created something that nobody in that room fully anticipated at the time. When you give an emperor the power to enforce a theological decision, you also give him the power to reverse it, or to lean on the people who made it until they reverse it themselves, or to exile the people who refuse to reverse it. The sword that enforced Nicaea in 325 was the same kind of sword that would be turned against Nicaea within a decade. Constantine himself demonstrated this before he died. His son Constantius would demonstrate it far more dramatically in the decades that followed. But that was still in the future. In the spring of 325, the bishops were traveling to Nicaea. Among them was Arius, summoned to answer for his teaching before the full assembly of the church. Among them also was the young deacon Athanasius. Accompanying Alexander of Alexandria, Athanasius was not old enough to vote in the council. He was there to observe, to assist, and to watch. He watched everything. He forgot nothing, and what he saw in that room would define every choice he made for the remaining 48 years of his life. Constantine arrived at Nicaea and discovered what every person who has ever tried to run a large meeting of highly opinionated experts discovers sooner or later. Everyone had already made up their minds. The bishops of the Eastern Church were not coming to Nicaea to be persuaded. They were coming to win. The Arian party was more substantial than the later Orthodox tradition preferred to acknowledge. Eusebius of Nicaea, one of the most politically connected bishops in the empire, a fellow student of Lucian of Antioch alongside Arius, arrived as the effective leader of the Arian caucus. He was experienced, intelligent, and had spent years cultivating relationships with people close to the emperor. He was not a man who could be dismissed or ignored. The anti-Arian party, led by Alexander of Alexandria, with the intense young Athanasius watching from the side of the room, had its own momentum. The council had been called because of the Arian controversy, and the controversy had already been condemned at a regional level. The direction of travel was not in Arius's favor, and everyone in that room knew it. But the question of exactly what the council would affirm, what language would be precise enough to exclude Arius's position while being acceptable to the broad middle of bishops who were not committed Arians, but who also had reservations about formulas that sounded too philosophically extreme. That question was still open when the council began. It would be closed by a word. A single Greek word that most of the bishops in that room had never expected to become the word that defined Christian orthodoxy for the next 17 centuries and counting. A word that Arius could not honestly sign. A word that would become, in the decades after the council, the most argued over piece of language in the history of the Christian tradition. A word whose full implications were still being worked out when the empire that produced it no longer existed. That word was waiting for them in Nicaea, and so was the argument that would never quite end, no matter how many times the church tried to close it. Picture the room, not the way centuries of paintings have pictured it, with golden light and serene figures arranged in perfect balance. Everyone calm and certain and dignified. The actual gathering at Nicaea in the summer of 325 was something considerably more human than that. Over 300 bishops had traveled from across the empire and beyond it, some of them carrying visible scars from the persecution that had ended only 12 years earlier. Men who had been tortured for their faith, who had watched members of their communities die in Roman arenas, who had spent years in hiding or in prison, were now sitting in a building paid for by the Emperor of Rome, waiting for that same emperor to walk through the door. The irony of that was not lost on any of them. When Constantine entered, the ancient sources agree on the effect he had on the room. He was tall. He wore robes of gold and purple. He moved through the gathered bishops the way a man moves when he has spent his entire adult life understanding that his physical presence is itself a form of power. He sat at the front of the assembly. He gave a short speech in Latin, which required translation into Greek for most of the men listening. He said He considered division within the church more dangerous than any war he had ever fought. He said he had called them here to find peace. Then he sat back and let the bishops argue. What followed over the next several weeks was not the orderly theological seminar that later Christian memory sometimes imagines. It was a room full of men with strong convictions and serious rhetorical training, fighting over questions they believed mattered more than anything else in the world. Ancient sources describe heated exchanges, bishops interrupting each other, factions forming and shifting around different proposed formulas, the emperor occasionally intervening to urge calm or to ask a question that revealed how little he understood of what was being debated. The core question facing the council was straightforward, even if the answer was not. How would the bishops describe the relationship between the Father and the Son? What language would be precise enough to define where orthodoxy stood, without alienating so many bishops that the unity Constantine wanted became impossible? The Arian party made its opening move. Eusebius of Nicaea stood and read aloud a clear statement of the Arian theological position. The reaction in the room, according to sources sympathetic to the Nicene side, was immediate and hostile. The document was apparently grabbed from his hands and torn. Whether that moment happened exactly as described or was later embellished is impossible to know for certain now. What is clear is that an explicit statement of Arian theology did not survive contact with the full assembly. The gathered bishops were not, in their majority, willing to go as far as Arius had gone. But rejecting Arius was easier than agreeing on what to affirm instead. And here is where the council faced its genuine difficulty. A difficulty that the later triumphant narrative of Nicaea tends to paper over. The Arian position had one significant advantage in the debate that the anti-Arian side struggled to overcome. It could be expressed in clear, direct, biblical language. Arius and his supporters could point to specific verses that anyone in that room would recognize. The Son is called the firstborn of all creation in the letter to the Colossians. Jesus himself says in the Gospel of John that the Father is greater than I. Paul writes in his first letter to the Corinthians that the Son will ultimately be subjected to the Father so that God may be all in all. Every one of those phrases came directly from Scripture. Every one of them pointed, if you read it with Arius's assumptions, toward a Son who was, in some ultimate sense, dependent on and subordinate to the Father. The challenge for the anti-Arian party was that the language they needed, the language precise enough to exclude Arius's position definitively, was not biblical language in any simple sense. You cannot find the word they ultimately chose anywhere in the New Testament. It is a Greek philosophical term. The word is homoousios. It means, most directly, of the same substance or of the same being. To say that the Son is homoousios with the Father is to say that whatever the Father is, at the deepest possible level of being, the Son is that same thing. Not similar to it, not derived from it, the same. The word had a complicated history before Nicaea arrived, and that history made a significant number of bishops nervous about using it. Decades earlier, in a different theological controversy, homoousios had been associated with a position called modalism, which collapsed the distinction between Father and Son entirely, treating them as two names for the same undifferentiated divine reality with no real difference between them at all. Using homoousios ran the risk of overcorrecting, of defining the Son so completely in terms of the Father that the genuine distinction between them, which Scripture clearly maintained and which Christian worship and prayer had always recognized, was lost. These concerns were not Arian maneuvering. The bishops raising them were serious theologians worried about trading one error for another. Their hesitation was legitimate, and the later tradition that dismissed everyone who questioned homoousios as a secret Arian was not being fair to the actual complexity of what those bishops were trying to navigate. Hosius of Cordoba, Constantine's personal religious advisor, appears to have been the figure who pushed homoousios into the center of the debate as the decisive term. Some historians believe this push came with something like imperial encouragement behind it. That Constantine, or those advising him, understood that this particular word was the one most likely to draw a line sharp enough to exclude Arius, while being definitive enough to be called a settlement. Whether that account is entirely accurate is debated. What is clear is that once homoousios entered the room as a serious proposal, the dynamic of the council shifted. Because here is what homoousios did that no other formula available to the council could do with the same precision. It closed every door. Every softer formula the council had considered gave Arius somewhere to stand. The Son is like the Father. The Son is similar to the Father in all things. The Son is the perfect image of the Father. The Son is the exact representation of the Father's being. Every one of those phrases could be signed by an Arian in good conscience. Because an Arian could agree that the Son, the most exalted of all created beings, was indeed very like the Father, similar to the Father, the closest possible image of the Father. Being like the Father was not the same thing as sharing the Father's, being completely and without qualification. Homoousios did not allow that escape. If the Son is of the same substance as the Father, there is no degree of similarity being described, no hierarchy of resemblance. The Son does not reflect the Father's being from a distance. However small, the Son shares the Father's being itself. Whatever God is, the Son is that, without qualification, without derivation, without the gap that Arius's entire theological position depended on. You could not sign that formula as an Arian and be honest about it. That was the point. The vote came. Of the more than 300 bishops present at Nicaea, all but 2 signed the creed. The 2 who refused, along with Arius himself, were condemned and sent into exile. Constantine ordered that the books of Arius be burned. The creed they signed contained the language that would become, in various expanded forms, the most widely repeated statement of Christian belief in all of history. The Son, it declared, was God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. Through him all things were made. That phrase, of one being with the Father, was homoousios, written into the creed's declarative voice. It was the wall. It was the line in the language that said, here is where Arianism ends and orthodoxy begins. Constantine had his result. He had his unity. He had over 300 bishops who had signed the same document and could be sent back to their provinces carrying the same formula. The controversy that had been fracturing the Eastern Church for 7 years was resolved, except that it was not resolved, not even close. The first sign came quickly. Within a few years of the council, the political landscape began to shift in ways that the decisive vote at Nicaea had not prevented. Bishops who had signed the creed under the weight of imperial expectation began to have second thoughts. or found that expressing those second thoughts was now politically safer than it had been inside the council chamber. The Arian and semi-Arian parties, temporarily silenced by the result, began reorganizing. The question of what homoousios actually meant, which had never been fully settled even among the bishops who voted for it, continued generating arguments among theologians who had all signed the same word, but who understood it differently. Eusebius of Nicomedia, the Arian leader at the council, was an extraordinarily skilled political operator. He worked the corridors of imperial access with a sophistication that Athanasius, for all his theological clarity and personal courage, could not match. He cultivated relationships with people close to Constantine. He reframed the problem for the emperor, suggesting that the real source of division in the church was not Arianism, but the intransigence of the Nicene hardliners, who were using homoousios as a weapon rather than a bridge. He argued that a broader, softer formula could achieve the unity Constantine wanted without the sharp edges that homoousios created. Constantine, who cared about unity more than theology, was open to this framing. Arius was recalled from exile. Constantine wrote to Athanasius, who had by then become Bishop of Alexandria following Alexander's death, ordering him to readmit Arius to communion. Athanasius refused. Constantine was furious. Athanasius began his first exile. Read that sequence slowly, because it contains everything important about what Nicaea actually accomplished and what it failed to accomplish. The man condemned by the council was recalled by the emperor who had enforced the condemnation. The man who had won the council was exiled by the same emperor for refusing to accept the recall. The formula that had been proclaimed with the full weight of imperial authority was being quietly renegotiated by the same authority that had proclaimed it. If you had been watching in the decade after Nicaea, you could have reasonably concluded that the council had settled the question the way a heavy object placed on a spring settles it. The spring was compressed, but the force had not gone away, and the moment the weight shifted, the spring was going to push back. The weight shifted. The spring pushed back. And what happened in the 50 years after Nicaea is one of the most important and least understood episodes in the entire history of Christianity. It is the episode that reveals what Nicaea actually was. Not the final word on the question Arius raised. Not the moment when the Christian world looked at the problem, solved it, and moved on, but the beginning of a 50-year struggle whose outcome was, for most of those 50 years, genuinely uncertain. A struggle that the Nicene side came very close to losing. And understanding how close they came to losing is the only honest way to understand what it means that they did not. Here is something that almost nobody who has heard of the Council of Nicaea knows. In the year 359, 34 years after Nicaea, the Emperor Constantinius II convened a council at a city called Sirmium in what is now Serbia. The bishops who gathered there signed a statement of faith. That statement did not use the word homoousios. It explicitly rejected the word homoousios. It declared that the Son was like the Father, similar to the Father, but carefully and deliberately avoided saying that the Son shared the Father's being in the absolute sense that Nicaea had affirmed. This was not a gathering of fringe figures meeting in secret to undermine orthodoxy. This was an official imperial council, convened by the ruling emperor of the Roman Empire. attended by bishops from across the Christian world, producing a creed that effectively reversed the central achievement of the council that had condemned Arius 34 years earlier. Jerome, writing about this period from the other side of it, reached for a sentence that captures the moment better than anything else could. The whole world groaned, he wrote, and was astonished to find itself Arian. Sit with that. The whole world astonished. 34 years after Nicaea. How does something like that happen? It happens the way most things in history happen. Not through a single dramatic reversal, but through the slow accumulation of decisions made by people managing immediate pressures, each one of which seemed defensible in the moment, the total of which pointed somewhere that none of them had fully intended. Constantine died in the year 337. He was baptized on his deathbed by Eusebius of Nicaea, the man who had led the Arian caucus at Nicaea 12 years earlier. That detail is not incidental. It tells you something honest about the direction of theological wind in the final years of Constantine's life. The emperor who had convened the council that condemned Arianism chose an Arian bishop to baptize him when death was close. His empire was divided among his 3 sons. The eastern portion, which contained the majority of the Christian population, and all the major theological centers of Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople, went to Constantius II. And Constantius II was not his father. Constantius was, in his theological sympathies, genuinely anti-Nicene. He was not a crude operator, using religion as a political instrument in the way his father sometimes had. He was a devout man who had thought seriously about the questions of his era and had arrived, through that thinking, at a position that was broadly sympathetic to the various anti-Nicene parties within the Church. He believed that homoousios had been a mistake. He believed the language of Nicaea had created more division than it resolved. He believed that a formula emphasizing the likeness of the Son to the Father, without the philosophical weight of homoousios, was more scripturally grounded and more likely to produce the unity that everyone claimed to want. Under his reign, the Nicene position moved from being the official imperial theology to being a minority view that the emperor actively worked against. Athanasius was exiled for the 2nd time, then the 3rd. Councils were called across the Eastern Empire that produced anti-Nicene formulas. Bishops who refused to sign these formulas were deposed and replaced with bishops who would. The institutional machinery of the Church, which Constantine had turned to enforce Nicaea, was turned by Constantius to enforce something else. The effect on ordinary Christian communities was genuinely disorienting. Imagine belonging to a faith whose official definition of its most fundamental belief changed depending on who sat on the throne. Imagine being a bishop who had signed the Nicene formula in good conscience and was now being told by the emperor to sign something different, and that your refusal was evidence of the kind of divisive stubbornness that was harming the Church. Imagine being one of the people in the congregation, hearing different things from different authorities in different years, trying to figure out which version of the creed you were supposed to believe and why it mattered so intensely that men were being sent into exile over it. This was the reality of Christianity in the middle decades of the 4th century. Not a confident institution proclaiming a settled faith. A contested space where the most fundamental question about the nature of Christ was being answered differently by different authorities at different times. And then the Goths entered the story. Sometime around the year 341, a man named Wulfila was consecrated as a missionary bishop to the Gothic peoples living along the northern frontier of the empire. Wulfila was a remarkable figure. He invented the Gothic alphabet. He translated the Bible into the Gothic language, creating the first written literature of the Germanic world. He brought the Christian faith to people who had never had it in a form they could read in their own tongue. He also brought them the version of Christianity that was current in the imperial church of his time and place, which was not the Nicene version. Wulfila was consecrated during a period when the anti-Nicene parties were ascendant in the Eastern Church. The Christianity he learned and absorbed and then carried to the Gothic peoples was a Christianity in which the Son was understood as the highest of created beings, exalted beyond all else, the agent of salvation, genuinely divine in a meaningful sense, but not co-eternal and co-equal with the Father in the absolute sense that homoousios required. He brought them in the language that later generations would use, Arian Christianity, and the Goths kept it. When the Visigoths crossed the Danube into Roman territory in 376, fleeing the pressure of the Huns pushing from the east, they brought their faith with them. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in the year 410, an event that shook the entire Roman world and prompted Augustine of Hippo to spend 13 years writing a response to it. The people doing the sacking were Christians. They were Arian Christians who believed something about the Son of God that the Council of Nicaea had declared to be heresy. When the Vandals crossed into North Africa in 429 and established a kingdom there that would last over a century, they were Arian Christians. When the Ostrogoths, under Theodoric, established a kingdom in Italy at the end of the 5th century, governing a predominantly Nicene Roman population with relative tolerance but maintaining their own distinct theological identity, they were Arian Christians. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced the Western Roman Empire in the 5th and 6th centuries were, in significant part, Arian kingdoms. The faith that had been condemned at Nicaea in 325 was, a century and a half later, the faith of the rulers of what had been the greatest empire in the Western world. Stop and think about what that means in terms of the question this story is asking. If you had been watching the Christian world in the year 400, you would have had reasonable grounds to conclude that the future of Christianity in the West was going to be shaped more by the theological tradition Arius represented than by the tradition that had condemned him. The Nicene Church existed. It was strong in certain places, particularly in North Africa where Augustine was writing, and increasingly in Constantinople. But across much of the territory that would become medieval Europe, the ruling class, the military power, the kings and their courts, were Arian. History did not go that way, but it came close enough that the question of why it did not is worth asking honestly. The answer is not primarily theological. It is political, and it unfolds over the late 5th and 6th centuries as the Gothic kingdoms gradually integrated with the Nicene Roman populations they governed. The Franks were the key. When Clovis, king of the Franks, converted to Christianity around the year 498, he did not convert to Arianism, as most Germanic kings of his era had done. He converted to Nicene Christianity, the Christianity of the Roman bishops and the Roman aristocracy he wanted to build alliances with. That decision gave the Frankish kingdom a political and ecclesiastical relationship with the papacy that no Arian kingdom could match. As Frankish power grew across what would become France, and then spread further, Nicene Christianity grew with it as the faith of the dominant political force in Western Europe. The Visigoths in Spain converted to Nicene Christianity in 589 under their king Reccared. The Lombards in northern Italy converted in the 7th century. Un by un, the Arian kingdoms either converted or were absorbed. By the time the Emperor Justinian in Constantinople was conducting his theological business in the mid-6th century, Arian Christianity, as a major institutional force in the West, was effectively finished. But here is what the clean narrative of Nicene triumph tends to obscure. The Christianity that had survived and consolidated by the year 600 was not simply the position that Athanasius had defended from Alexandria in 328. It had been debated, refined, argued over, and expanded across 2.5 centuries. The Nicene formula had been developed and clarified at the Council of Constantinople in 381. The question of how the divine and human natures related in Christ had generated fierce controversy at the Council of Ephesus in 431 and then at Chalcedon in 451. Chalcedon produced a formula describing Christ as fully divine and fully human. Two natures in one person, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. And that formula split the Eastern Church in ways that have never healed. The Coptic Church of Egypt, the Ethiopian Church, the Armenian Apostolic Church, the Syriac Orthodox Church all rejected Chalcedon and separated from the Imperial Church over it. Those separations exist today. 15 centuries later, the question of who Jesus was, which Arius raised in Alexandria in 318, is still producing ecclesiastical divisions in the 21st century. And through all of it, the ghost of what had almost happened stayed in the background of the story. Consider Athanasius, living through his second or third exile, watching the councils of the 350s produce anti-Nicene formulas that most of the Eastern bishops signed without visible reluctance. He knew, because he was living it, that the outcome at Nicaea had not settled the question. He knew that the world could go the other way. He had been watching it go the other way for years. He kept writing. He kept arguing. He kept insisting that the line being erased was the line that had to hold. Most people around him thought he was being stubborn past the point of reason. He was being stubborn past the point of reason. And he was right. That combination, stubborn past the point of reason and right, is not comfortable to be around. It is not the kind of quality that makes a person easy to love, or easy to work with, or easy to govern. It is, however, sometimes the quality that keeps a thread from being cut when everyone around it has decided that cutting it would be simpler than maintaining it. Athanasius maintained the thread. Through 5 exiles and 4 hostile emperors, and 30 years during which the official position of the Imperial Church was something closer to what Arius had taught than to what Nicaea had declared. And then Theodosius I came to power. In the year 380, Theodosius issued an edict declaring Nicene Christianity the official faith of the Roman Empire. The following year, the Council of Constantinople affirmed and expanded the Nicene formula into the version that most Christians still recite today. Homoousios held. The line that Athanasius had been defending alone for so long was officially drawn again, this time with enough political weight behind it to last. Arius had been dead for over 40 years. Athanasius had been dead for 7 years. Neither of them lived to see the moment when the question was, at least in terms of official imperial Christianity, finally settled. But what Arius had started, and what Athanasius had resisted, had between them produced something that neither of them intended, and that neither of them could have fully anticipated. They had forced the Christian world to define itself, not to describe itself in the comfortable, ambiguous, evocative language of worship and prayer that it had used for 3 centuries. To define itself, to say, in precise and unambiguous philosophical language, what it actually meant when it called Jesus the Son of God. To draw lines and take responsibility for those lines and defend them against every pressure that came to push them back. That process took most of a century. It produced councils and creeds and exiles and political maneuvering and moments of genuine courage and moments of institutional cowardice. It produced a tradition that 2 billion people today inhabit without knowing most of this history. And it started with one man, in one church, in one city, who looked at the texts that everyone around him was also reading and asked a question that everyone around him had decided was safer left unasked. There was when he was not. The world almost answered yes. You are right. It came very close. Go back to Constantinople. Go back to the street where Arius fell. The year 336. The night before everything was supposed to be resolved. You understand now what you could not have understood at the beginning of this story. The man walking through that city was not simply an old priest on his way to a ceremony. He was the living center of a question that had split a religion, pulled an emperor away from running an empire, produced a word that became a wall, and then watched that wall crack and nearly collapse in the decades that followed. He had been condemned at the largest gathering of Christian bishops in history. He had been exiled. He had been recalled by the same emperor who had enforced his condemnation. He had been used as a political instrument by people on both sides who understood his symbolic value better than they understood his actual arguments. He had outlived Alexander, the bishop who first brought charges against him. He had watched the position that Nicaea declared heretical come within a generation of becoming the dominant theology of the Christian world. And tomorrow morning, by order of Constantine himself, he was going to walk through the doors of Hagia Irene and be restored to communion with the Church of Constantinople. He never walked through those doors. Sometime that evening, in a street in the city, Arius collapsed and died. The ancient sources describe what happened to his body with a specificity that tells you the people writing those descriptions wanted you to feel something particular about them. His opponents said God had intervened at the last possible moment, preventing a heretic from re-entering sacred space through divine judgment that was visible and decisive and perfectly timed. His supporters said the timing was too perfect to be coincidence, that a man who had survived exile and condemnation and years of political maneuvering did not simply collapse and die the night before his restoration without human help. We do not know. We will not know. The sources we have were written by people who needed his death to mean something specific, which makes them useful for understanding the controversy and unreliable for understanding what actually happened in that street. 17 centuries later, the cause of his death remains genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is what he left behind. The question did not die with him. It kept moving. It crossed the borders of the empire that had tried to contain it. It traveled with Wulfila into the forests and settlements of the Gothic peoples and became the faith of kingdoms that would outlast Rome itself. It lived in the Arian Christianity of the Visigoths and Vandals and Lombards for 2 centuries after the Western Empire fell. It shaped the theological landscape of early medieval Europe in ways that the clean narrative of Nicene triumph tends to minimize. And then it surfaced again. In the early 16th century, a Spanish physician named Michael Servetus published a work arguing that the traditional doctrine of the Trinity was not taught in Scripture and that the orthodox understanding of Christ's divine nature was a philosophical framework imposed on the original Christian message from outside. Servetus was not a marginal figure writing for a fringe audience. He was a serious scholar, engaging with the primary sources in their original languages. And his arguments were serious enough that they could not simply be ignored. He was burned at the stake in Geneva in the year 1553 by John Calvin, who had his own quarrels with Rome across a long list of subjects, but not on this particular one. The question that Arius had pressed in Alexandria in 318 was still considered dangerous enough in 1553 to execute a man over. In the 17th century in England, Isaac Newton quietly worked through the theological literature of the Arian controversy and arrived at conclusions he spent his career being careful never to publish. Newton believed that the Nicene doctrine of the Trinity was a corruption of original Christianity, that the Council had imposed Greek philosophical categories on a tradition that did not require them, and that the Arian reading of Scripture was closer to what the texts actually said. The man who described the laws governing motion and gravity left behind over 1 million words of private theological writing, most of it focused on exactly the questions Arius had raised. His executors understood what those papers contained and kept them unpublished for over 2 centuries. Newton, of all people, was afraid of what would happen if the world knew where his reading of the Nicene controversy had taken him. In 18th century New England, the theological movement called Unitarianism developed among communities that had grown genuinely uncomfortable with the Nicene doctrine of the Trinity and preferred a vision of God that preserved, as Arius had tried to preserve, the absolute uniqueness of the Father. The Unitarian tradition never called itself Arian, but it was standing on ground that Arius would have recognized, asking questions that he had asked, reaching conclusions that rhymed with his in ways that were not accidental. And today, there are roughly 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses in the world. They meet in kingdom halls, in countries on every continent. They read the same New Testament passages that Arius read in Alexandria. They follow the logic of those passages to conclusions that closely resemble, in their structural shape, the conclusions Arius reached. The Son, in their theology, is the first and greatest of created beings, the agent through whom everything else was made, genuinely divine in a meaningful sense, worthy of reverence and devotion, but not co-eternal and co-equal with the Father in the absolute sense that Nicaea affirmed. They do not call themselves Arian. They would likely object to the label, but the question they are answering, and the direction they are answering it in, occupies a neighborhood in the landscape of Christian thought that Arius inhabited 17 centuries before them. 8 million people in the 21st century, standing, without knowing it, in proximity to a question that a presbyter in Alexandria refused to leave alone. And then there are the people who belong to none of these traditions, who are not Unitarians or Jehovah's Witnesses or private students of Isaac Newton's unpublished papers, who attend churches where the Nicene Creed is recited every Sunday, where the doctrine of the Trinity is taught as settled truth, where the full Nicene formula is the water they swim in without noticing it is water. Even there, even in the most thoroughly Nicene communities in the world, the question lives. It lives every time someone reads the Gospel of John and holds in their mind at the same moment the sentence, "The Word was God," and the sentence, "The Father is greater than I," and sits for just a second with the tension between them before moving on. It lives every time someone reads Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and arrives at the passage where the Son will be subjected to the Father so that God may be all in all, and wonders, even briefly, what subjected means in that context, what it tells us about the relationship between them, whether the hierarchy Paul describes is temporary or permanent, or something that neither word quite captures. It lives every time a child asks the question that children always ask, because they have not yet learned that adults prefer not to hear it. Asked quite so directly, if Jesus is God, who was he praying to? Adults in those communities have answers to that question. Careful answers, theologically serious answers. Answers that have been refined across 17 centuries of exactly this kind of pressure, from exactly this kind of question. The answers are real and deserve to be taken seriously. But the question underneath the answers does not disappear. It cannot disappear because it does not arise from ignorance or bad faith. It arises from reading the texts that Christianity has always claimed as its foundation, reading them with the kind of close and honest attention that Arius brought to them in Alexandria, and noticing that they do not resolve themselves into a single clean picture without help, without the help of tradition, of councils, of creeds, of centuries of theological work that built the interpretive framework within which those texts are now read. Arius looked at the texts before most of that framework existed. He saw what they said on their own terms, and what he saw led him to a conclusion that the tradition, once it had built the framework, could not accept. This story is not an argument that Arius was right. The theological tradition that condemned him had reasons for doing so that were serious and remain serious. The argument that Athanasius spent his life making, that a created being, however exalted, cannot bridge the gap between the Creator and the creation, cannot fully bring human beings to God, because it does not fully have the life of God to give, is not a weak argument. It is an argument that serious theologians found compelling in the 4th century, and continue to find compelling today. The Nicene tradition is not simply an exercise in imperial power that got mistaken for theology. It is a genuine theological position with its own internal coherence and its own insight into what the Christian claim about Jesus requires. But this story is also not a simple vindication of the council that condemned him. The process that produced Nicaea was political as well as theological. The pressures that shaped its outcome included imperial ambition and personal rivalry, and the specific dynamics of a room full of men who had been traveling for weeks and who knew the emperor was watching. The formula that emerged was the right formula. in the judgment of the tradition that inherited it. But the process that produced it was a human process, with all the complications that human processes carry. What this story is, finally, is something simpler than either of those framings. It is the record of a question that was real, asked by a real person who believed it deserved a real answer. A question that the tradition had been carrying for 3 centuries without fully facing. A question that, when it was finally faced directly, forced a reckoning that shaped the Christianity 2 billion people inhabit today. A question that left its mark on everything that came after, visible or not, acknowledged or not. The creed that answered Arius begins with language that is, among other things, a direct response to his most famous sentence. He said there was when he was not. The creed says begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. Through him all things were made. Every phrase in that passage was chosen because of what he said. Every word is a door closed against the place where he stood. He is in the creed that condemned him. His question is in every line of it. Go back one more time to Constantinople, to the street, to the night of 336. A man walks through a city he is not from, toward a ceremony he has been waiting 11 years for. Tomorrow he will be restored. Tomorrow, the word that has followed him across every city he was forced to leave will be lifted. Tomorrow, the long argument will reach something that looks, from the outside, like an ending. He does not make it to tomorrow. We do not know why. We do not know who, if anyone, made sure he would not. We know that his enemies were relieved and called it providence. We know that his friends were devastated and called it murder. We know that the truth of what happened in that street is one of the things history swallowed and did not give back. What history did give back is everything else. The songs he wrote that carried his question into the streets of Alexandria. The arguments he made that forced the church to find language precise enough to answer them. The controversy that bears his name and that ran through 50 years of empire and theology and exile and council and Gothic kingdoms and medieval Europe and the Reformation and private papers locked away in Newton's study, congregations meeting in kingdom halls today. All of it started with a man who read the texts everyone else was reading and noticed something that everyone else had decided was safer left unnoticed. He asked a question the tradition could not ignore. The tradition answered, and the question is still there, underneath the answer, waiting for anyone who reads slowly enough to feel it. Nicaea said begotten, not made. Arius asked what begotten means. 17 centuries later, in churches on every continent, people repeat the answer every Sunday. The question waits underneath every word of it. It has been waiting since 336. It is waiting right now.